The Galactic Senate Chamber was an architectural marvel, a vast circular hall with towering columns of polished obsidian that reached up into the endless void of the artificial sky. Thousands of seats surrounded a central podium, each representing a different species, a different world, a different civilization that had risen to claim its place among the stars. Some representatives attended in person, their towering or diminutive forms seated in hovering chairs designed to accommodate their unique physiologies. Others participated via holographic projections, their spectral images flickering with the soft hum of advanced transmission technology. Despite the variety of races, cultures, and philosophies gathered in this place, there was one universal truth among them all: power was measured here, alliances were forged, and the fate of the galaxy was decided within these walls. Yet amidst this grand assembly, one seat stood empty. Always. It was positioned near the inner circle, a place of prominence reserved for the most influential and ancient civilizations. The polished plaque on its high back bore a single word: Terra. A name that evoked curiosity, frustration, and, in some, a deep unease. For centuries, the humans had been allocated a seat in the Senate, just as every advanced race was when it reached the criteria for inclusion. But while the others had eagerly sent diplomats, ambassadors, and political tacticians to secure their positions in the great cosmic hierarchy, Earth had done the unthinkable: it had ignored its invitation. At first, it had been seen as an oversight. Perhaps humans had misunderstood the significance of the Senate. Messages had been sent, emissaries dispatched, all met with polite but firm refusals. The Senate had waited, assuming that sooner or later, humans would recognize the necessity of participation. Decades passed, then centuries. While other species fought wars over border disputes, navigated political upheavals, and traded resources for influence, Earth remained silent, watching but never engaging. Now, patience was wearing thin. High Chancellor Orlan of the Virian Dominion, a towering being with obsidian skin and golden eyes that never blinked, stood at the center podium. He was one of the longest-serving members of the Senate, a master of rhetoric and diplomacy, but today, even he could not mask his irritation. "We cannot continue to allow this farce to persist," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. "For too long, Terra has been afforded privileges it does not respect. They hold a seat among us, yet they refuse to sit. They are granted influence, yet they wield none. This insult cannot be tolerated any longer." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Some representatives nodded, others exchanged knowing glances. A few remained silent, watching with careful calculation. From a distant sector, a voice rose. Senator Quell of the Sakari Confederation, a slender reptilian creature with emerald scales and piercing black eyes, leaned forward. "The humans have ignored every summons. They refuse every envoy. Tell me, High Chancellor, what do you propose we do? We cannot force them to take their seat." Orlan's golden eyes narrowed. "Perhaps we should revoke it." A collective stillness settled over the room. The suggestion was extreme, unprecedented. No species had ever been stripped of its seat in the Senate, not even during times of war. The implications were vast, dangerous even. Ambassador Shiran of the Zalari Syndicate, a being of shifting silver light encased in a translucent exosuit, spoke next. "Before we take such drastic action, I believe we must ask ourselves a far more pressing question." Orlan turned to her. "And what question is that, Ambassador?" Shiran's glowing form flickered, a sign of deep contemplation. "Why?" A hush fell over the chamber. "The humans are not ignorant," she continued. "They are not isolated. Their fleets travel the stars. Their technology rivals our own. They have witnessed the workings of this Senate, and still, they refuse to participate. The question is not whether we should remove them but rather why have they chosen to remove themselves?" Silence followed. It was a question no one had truly dared to consider. It was easy to dismiss human absence as arrogance, but what if it was something else entirely? What if the humans knew something the rest of the Senate did not? Orlan's expression darkened. He was not a creature prone to paranoia, but the weight of the question gnawed at him. "The answer to that question," he said slowly, "is long overdue." Murmurs of agreement spread once more, but now there was an undercurrent of unease. The Senate had faced many threats: warlords, rogue artificial intelligences, species with destructive tendencies, but humans had never been a threat. Not openly. They had simply remained apart, silent, untouchable. Orlan took a measured breath. Then let it be decided. We shall send a delegation to Earth. Not as petitioners, not as diplomats begging for their presence, but as an authority demanding answers. We will uncover the truth of Terra's absence. A formal vote was called. The decision was unanimous. As the meeting adjourned, a ripple of anticipation swept through the chamber. No one spoke it aloud, but the thought lingered in every mind present. What if humanity had a reason for staying away? And what if the Senate was about to uncover something it was never meant to know? Far away, in the silent halls of Earth's abandoned Senate seat, the name Terra gleamed under the artificial light, untouched by time, unclaimed by those it was meant for. The Senate's decision spread across the galactic network within hours. Every major political faction, intelligence agency, and news syndicate was abuzz with speculation. A delegation to Earth had never been attempted before, and now, with a formal mission approved, the eyes of the galaxy turned toward the silent world that had, for centuries, remained apart. Some saw it as a long overdue demand for accountability. Others feared it as the first step toward a confrontation no one understood. High Chancellor Orlan did not share his concerns openly, but as he reviewed the list of selected delegates, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing against his thoughts. The mission had to be carefully balanced. Too many military officials, and humanity might see it as a provocation. Too many diplomats, and they might be ignored, just as every envoy before them had been. After hours of deliberation, the delegation was finalized. 5 individuals, each chosen for their unique expertise and influence. Ambassador Shiran of the Zalari Syndicate, a seasoned negotiator whose ability to dissect political motives was unmatched. She was the only one in the Senate who had openly questioned humanity's absence, making her a natural choice to lead the discussions. Senator Quell of the Sakari Confederation, a pragmatist who viewed the humans not as a threat but as an anomaly to be understood. His species had a long history of analyzing interstellar powers, and his presence ensured that Earth's response would be dissected with precision. General Varen of the Zurak Imperium, the most controversial choice. His empire had little patience for secrecy and even less for species that refused to show deference. He had not been chosen for diplomacy, he had been chosen as a show of strength, a reminder that the Senate would not tolerate further evasion. Dr. Lasana of the Etherian Research Collective, a scholar who had spent her career studying the evolution of advanced civilizations. She had pushed for peaceful contact with humanity for years and had personally analyzed their technological and scientific progress. Her inclusion was meant to provide insight beyond the political sphere. And finally, Envoy Diran of the Virian Dominion, a direct representative of Orlan himself. He was neither a warrior nor a diplomat, but a man whose presence alone signified the gravity of the Senate's intent. His role was simple: observe, report, and, if necessary, remind humanity that its continued absence would not be tolerated. The delegation departed from the Senate's central station aboard a high-speed diplomatic vessel, its hull gleaming under the artificial lights of the docking bay. The journey to Earth was not long. Humanity had, after all, expanded far beyond its homeworld, and their trade routes intersected with nearly every major sector of space. Yet despite their presence in the galactic economy, their political silence remained absolute. As the ship entered the Sol system, the delegates gathered in the observation chamber, staring at the blue and white orb that had given rise to one of the most enigmatic civilizations in history. The sight of Earth was nothing remarkable. Many planets had oceans and landmasses, atmospheres teeming with life, but there was something undeniably unsettling about its stillness. No war fleets, no planetary defense platforms, no visible signs of a civilization bracing for external threats. It was quiet. Shiran folded her hands, her shimmering form pulsating faintly as she considered their next steps. "We will follow standard diplomatic procedure," she said. "Transmit our credentials and request formal clearance to land." Quell tapped his claws against the console, his emerald scales catching the dim light. "Do you expect them to respond?" "If they don't," Varen rumbled, his armored form shifting, "then we land anyway." Lasana shot him a sharp glance. We are here for answers, not to provoke an incident. I doubt they will see it as an incident, Quell muttered. More likely, they'll see it as an inconvenience. Diran remained silent, his golden eyes fixed on the planet below. He had spent years studying human interactions from afar, monitoring their expansion, their economic dealings, their occasional, cryptic messages to the galactic community. They were neither aggressive nor reclusive, neither conquerors nor pacifists. They simply existed. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. The ship's communication officer activated the transmission relay. This is the Galactic Senate delegation requesting official landing clearance on behalf of the governing authority of Earth. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No response. Varen exhaled sharply, the vents along his armor releasing a burst of heated air. Enough. We land. Before anyone could object, a new signal interrupted their systems. A transmission clear, direct, and unmistakably human. Permission granted. Proceed to designated coordinates. The delegation exchanged glances. There was no identifying signature, no indication of who had spoken. But the meaning was clear. They were expected. The diplomatic vessel descended through Earth's atmosphere, piercing through layers of white clouds before emerging over a sprawling landscape. They had expected a massive metropolis, a planetary capital befitting a species of Earth's influence. Instead, they found themselves approaching a seemingly ordinary city, its structures blending seamlessly with nature, technology integrated into the environment rather than imposed upon it. This isn't what I expected, Lysana murmured. Shiran studied the layout of the settlement below. No planetary shield generators. No visible military presence. This is either a calculated display of trust or arrogance. Their ship settled on a landing platform, a vast, open-air structure surrounded by what appeared to be a government complex. As the delegation disembarked, the air was crisp, filled with the scent of vegetation and distant rain. The humans had not sent an honor guard, nor had they assembled an audience. There was only one figure waiting for them, a man standing at the far end of the platform, dressed in simple, unadorned attire. Shiran stepped forward, followed closely by the others. I am Ambassador Shiran of the Zalari Syndicate. We represent the Galactic Senate and... I know why you're here, the man interrupted. His voice was calm, unhurried. Follow me. Varen bristled. You will address the delegation with respect. The man met his gaze without fear. Then let's not waste time. You came for answers. I'll take you to them. No introduction. No explanation. Just a simple directive. As the delegation followed him into the heart of the city, an unspoken tension settled over them. The humans had not asked why they had come, nor had they shown any surprise. They had been waiting. And that, more than anything, was what unnerved them the most. The delegation followed the human through the city, moving in silence as their surroundings stretched out before them. The streets were unlike those of any galactic capital they had seen, clean, efficient, and eerily quiet. Technology was seamlessly integrated into the environment, with structures built to complement the natural world rather than dominate it. There were no towering skyscrapers, no dense clusters of industry or commerce, yet there was an undeniable sense of advancement. Shiran studied the pathways they walked, noting the absence of traditional transport systems. No automated shuttles glided through the air, no personal vehicles clogged the roads. The people they passed moved at a leisurely pace, their expressions calm, purposeful. There was no sign of poverty, no visible security forces, no markers of social hierarchy. It was a city designed not for control, but for coexistence. Varen walked beside her, his heavy footsteps echoing against the smooth pavement. This is unnatural, he muttered. A world without visible power, without military presence? Either they are fools, or they are hiding something. Quell tilted his head, his dark eyes scanning the architecture. No government insignias, no banners, no formal representation of leadership. His voice was low, speculative. Who rules here? The human leading them did not turn, did not acknowledge their conversation. He continued at an even pace, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, as if he had long since grown tired of explaining things to outsiders. Lysana, who had been absorbing the details in silence, finally spoke. "They do." Shiran glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Lysana gestured subtly at the people around them. "Look at them. No one acts as if they are being watched. No one hesitates before speaking to another. No one glances toward the sky in fear of surveillance. This isn't a civilization held together by authority. It's held together by something else." Before anyone could respond, the human stopped before a towering structure, its dark surface smooth and unmarked. There were no visible entrances, no windows, just an expanse of seamless material that reflected the overcast sky. He placed his palm against the surface, and a soft ripple spread outward, dissolving a section of the wall into nothingness. Without a word, he stepped inside. The delegation hesitated only for a moment before following. The interior was vast, an open chamber with no discernible purpose at first glance. The walls pulsed faintly with a deep blue light, rhythmic and steady. The air was cool, carrying an almost imperceptible hum that resonated through the space. Diran exhaled slowly, his golden eyes narrowing. "This is not a government building." The human finally turned to face them. His gaze was unreadable, his expression devoid of pride or amusement. "No, it isn't." Shiran stepped forward. "Then what is it?" The blue light along the walls pulsed once, then shifted, forming intricate patterns that flickered across the smooth surfaces. Shapes, numbers, star maps, data streams flowing too fast for the eye to follow. Lysana inhaled sharply. "It's a processing center." The human nodded. "It is." Quell's claws twitched. "Processing what?" The human tilted his head slightly, as if deciding how much to explain. "Everything." The words settled heavily between them. Varen crossed his arms, his armored form rigid. "That is meaningless." The human exhaled slowly, then gestured toward the shifting data on the walls. "The Senate debates policies, votes on laws, struggles with crises. Your leaders believe they are steering the course of the galaxy." He turned his gaze toward the delegation, his expression unchanging. "They are not." Shiran's pulse quickened, but she forced her voice to remain level. "Explain." The human walked to the center of the room, where a circular platform rose from the floor. As he stepped onto it, the data streams coalesced, forming three-dimensional projections above him, holographic representations of the galaxy, shifting and changing in real time. Star systems flickered into view, their trade routes, political alliances, and military movements traced in luminous lines. Events played out in fast-forward wars, treaties, economic collapses, resurgences, all mapped with chilling accuracy. Lysana took a slow step forward, her breath shallow. "This is..." "Prediction," the human finished. "Projection. Analysis." He gestured to the flowing data. "Every action, every decision made in the Senate, in your empires, your federations, your coalitions, mapped, studied, anticipated." His eyes locked onto Shiran's. "You came here demanding to know why Earth does not take its seat." He gestured to the projections. "This is why." Shiran's throat tightened. "You knew." The human's expression remained unreadable. "We have always known." Quell's voice was low, almost disbelieving. "You predicted the course of galactic history." The human inclined his head. "Yes." Varen stepped forward, his stance aggressive. "Then you manipulated it." The human's eyes did not waver. "No." Lysana's mind raced as she struggled to process what she was seeing. The implications were staggering. "Then what do you do?" The human turned slightly, looking up at the projections. The lights reflected in his gaze, cold and distant. "We observe. We measure. We verify." He paused, then added, "And we wait." Diran spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. "For what?" The human met his gaze. "For the inevitable." The words sent a chill through the delegation. Chiron's voice was barely above a whisper. You do nothing? The human's expression was impassive. Would it matter if we did? Silence fell over the chamber. The answer was clear. Chiron's hands clenched at her sides. You could have stopped wars. Prevented collapses. Saved civilizations. The human inclined his head slightly. Perhaps. His tone did not change. But tell me, Ambassador, what do you think happens when someone tries to stop the tide from rising? Lysana's stomach twisted. It rises anyway. The human nodded. Yes. Quell exhaled slowly. And so you watched. We understood. Durin's jaw tightened. And you allowed billions to die. The human did not look away. And if we had interfered, how many more would have died? If we had pushed events in another direction, would the outcome have been better? Varen's fists clenched. You don't know that. The human's voice remained calm. No. But neither do you. The words settled over the delegation like a weight. Chiron swallowed hard. Then what do you expect us to do with this knowledge? The human studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not out of amusement or condescension, but something else entirely. That, he said, is your decision. The projections flickered, shifting once more. The future unfolded before them, infinite possibilities stretching toward the unknown. And for the first time, the delegation realized they were no longer certain which path had already been decided. The chamber remained silent long after the human had spoken. The delegation stood motionless, their minds racing as they stared at the projections shifting in the air before them. Wars they had debated in the Senate, treaties they had struggled to negotiate, entire civilizations that had risen and fallen mapped, analyzed, predicted with terrifying accuracy. Chiron's hands were trembling, though she forced herself to keep them at her sides. Her mind was trained to process complex political maneuvering, but this was something else entirely. The idea that everything the Senate had ever fought to control, to govern, had already been calculated, that the choices they believed were theirs to make had already been foreseen, it was unbearable. Quell's gaze was fixed on the data streams. His emerald scales had darkened slightly, a reaction his species exhibited under extreme stress. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. You claim to observe. To measure. To wait. His voice was quiet, sharp as a blade. But what happens when your projections tell you of something you do not want to come to pass? The human regarded him with an expression that was unreadable. Then we verify. Quell's eyes narrowed. And if it is verified? For the first time, the human's gaze shifted, just slightly. Then we adapt. Chiron's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was saying. Despite all the cold logic, despite the insistence that Earth did not interfere, there was an exception. Varen stepped forward, his armored boots striking the floor with deliberate force. His massive frame radiated tension, his voice a low growl. You are lying. The human's expression did not change. No. You are lying, Varen repeated, his voice growing harsher. You have done nothing, you have allowed chaos to run its course, you have watched billions die, and now you expect us to believe that you choose when to interfere? His eyes burned with fury. What makes you the ones to decide? The human finally moved, stepping down from the platform as the projections faded from view. He took slow, measured steps toward Varen, stopping just close enough to meet his gaze. Despite the Zurak general's towering presence, the human did not flinch. What makes the Senate the ones to decide? His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room like a blade. What makes your leaders any different? Varen's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. The human continued. Your empires expand. Your coalitions impose laws. Your wars reshape the balance of power. And each time, you tell yourselves it is for the greater good. That it is justified. That it is necessary. His eyes never left Varen's. You decide who leads, who prospers, who falls. You call it governance. He took another step closer. We call it inevitability. Shiran forced herself to speak, her voice strained but steady. You make it sound as if you do not care about the outcome at all. The human turned to her. We care, he said. But caring does not change the tide. Lisanna inhaled sharply, stepping forward. That's not true, she said, shaking her head. If you care, then you act. The human studied her for a long moment before answering. Then tell me, doctor, he said, his voice quiet, how many times have you seen an intervention lead to unforeseen disaster? Lisanna hesitated, her throat tightening. She had studied the collapse of countless civilizations. She had read the histories, seen the evidence. How often had a species interfered in another's affairs only to create a greater catastrophe? How often had an attempt to stop suffering only prolonged it in another form? She had no answer. The human nodded slightly, as if he had already known. That is why we do not interfere. Diran, who had remained silent until now, exhaled slowly. But you do, he said at last. His golden eyes locked onto the human's. When the calculations tell you that something is truly catastrophic, something beyond acceptable loss, you act. The human did not deny it. Shiran's mind raced. How many times? The human regarded her for a moment, then looked past her, at the empty space where the projections had been. Less than you think, he said. More than you realize. Varen let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. You play with fate. You sit in the shadows and decide when to tip the scales. You are no better than the Senate. The human's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not amusement. Something else. We do not play with fate, he said. We accept it. Shiran felt something cold settle in her chest. And what happens when fate tells you that the Senate itself is a mistake? The human was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he said, we verify. The delegation froze. Quell was the first to recover, his voice barely above a whisper. You mean to tell us? His hands curled slightly, his claws flexing. That you have already considered the fall of the Senate? The human inclined his head. Yes. Diran's jaw tightened. And? The human exhaled slowly. We are still verifying. The weight of the words crashed down upon them. For centuries, the Galactic Senate had believed itself to be the pillar of order, the foundation upon which the balance of the known galaxy rested. The wars it had ended, the treaties it had forged, it had all been done under the assumption that the Senate was a necessary institution, a stabilizing force. And now, the humans were telling them that it might not be. Shiran felt her pulse pounding in her ears. If your calculations tell you that the Senate is a failure, she swallowed, forcing the words out. Will you let it fall? The human met her gaze, his expression unreadable. If it must, he said simply. Silence fell. A silence heavier than any before. The implications were too vast to comprehend. The Senate had come to Earth demanding answers, expecting resistance, arrogance, perhaps even hostility. But what they had found was something far worse. They had found a species that did not need them. And worse still, a species that had already accepted a future where the Senate did not exist at all. Shiran forced herself to steady her breathing. And if we change? The human's gaze lingered on her. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. Then we adapt. Varen exhaled sharply, his frustration radiating from every movement. This is madness, he muttered. You claim not to manipulate, yet you hold the power to end everything. The human turned slightly, glancing at the walls of the chamber, where data still pulsed in quiet patterns. No, he said. You do. The delegation stood frozen. The human stepped away from the platform, walking toward the exit of the chamber. You came here seeking answers, he said without turning back. Now you have them. Shiran felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. And what are we supposed to do with them? The human finally turned, his expression calm, distant. Whatever you decide. The chamber doors slid open. The air outside was crisp, unchanged. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But for the delegation, nothing would ever be the same. The delegation stepped out of the chamber into the open air, the weight of the conversation still pressing heavily upon them. The sky above was a soft gray, clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. The city stretched out before them, unchanged, as if the revelation inside the chamber had been nothing more than a passing conversation. But Chiron knew better. Nothing was the same. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to steady her thoughts. The human had not tried to convince them, had not pleaded for them to see things from his perspective. He had merely shown them the truth as Earth understood it. And the truth was unbearable. Quell walked beside her, his usual composure replaced by a quiet intensity. His claws twitched at his sides, his gaze locked on the ground as if trying to process the enormity of what they had learned. Varen, on the other hand, radiated silent fury. His massive frame was tense, his hands curled into fists. For a warrior like him, the idea of fate being an inevitability, of conflict being observed rather than resolved through strength, was a direct insult to everything he believed in. Lysana's face was pale, her mind undoubtedly dissecting every piece of information, every projection, every possibility she had just witnessed. She had dedicated her life to understanding the course of civilizations, and now she had been given an answer she could never unsee. Diran, as always, remained unreadable. His golden eyes flickered with thought, but his expression betrayed nothing. The human who had led them through the city walked a few steps ahead, not offering any further words of explanation. He had said all that needed to be said. As they approached the landing platform where their vessel awaited, Chiron finally spoke. "What happens now?" The human turned to face her. "That depends on you." Chiron's throat tightened. "We cannot return to the Senate and pretend we never heard this." "No," the human agreed. "You cannot." Varen exhaled sharply, stepping forward. "Then why tell us at all?" His voice was sharp, filled with restrained anger. "If you have spent centuries watching, waiting, letting fate play out as you claim, why now? Why reveal this to us?" The human met his glare without hesitation. "Because you were ready to ask." Varen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Chiron forced herself to think beyond the initial shock, beyond the rage and confusion that churned inside her. The humans had not feared their presence, had not resisted their questions. That meant something. "You've calculated what happens next, haven't you?" she asked quietly. The human's lips curved slightly. "We have." Chiron swallowed. "And?" The human studied her for a long moment before answering. "That depends on what you do with the truth." A silence settled between them. Quell finally exhaled, shaking his head. "If we go back and reveal what we've seen," he hesitated. "No one will believe us." "They will," Diran murmured. "Eventually." Chiron turned to face him. "And if they do?" Diran's expression was unreadable. "Then the Senate will collapse." The words sent a chill through the group. Varen scoffed, crossing his arms. "You assume too much. Even if we tell them, even if they believe us, what makes you think the Senate would fall?" The human remained silent, allowing the question to linger. Lysana rubbed her temple, her voice quiet. "Because if the Senate was built on the belief that it controlled the course of galactic history, then proving it never did will destroy its foundation." The truth settled over them like a heavy weight. Chiron closed her eyes for a brief moment. "If that happens, if the Senate ceases to exist, what replaces it?" The human gave her a long, measured look. "That is not for us to decide." Varen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You expect us to believe you have no interest in shaping what comes next?" The human's expression did not change. "We observe. We verify. We adapt." Quell let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You make it sound so simple." It is, the human said. You just refuse to accept it. Chiron turned her gaze back to the city. It stretched out before her, undisturbed, moving forward as if the universe itself did not hang in the balance. For the humans, perhaps it didn't. The delegation had come seeking answers. They had found them. And now, they had to make a choice. Chiron inhaled deeply, then turned back to the human. Thank you. It was all she could say. The human inclined his head. Safe travels, Ambassador. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the city as if he had never been there at all. The delegation stood in silence for several long moments before finally making their way back to the vessel. As the ship lifted from the platform, Chiron watched Earth shrink beneath them, a world that had never needed the Senate, had never sought to impose its will upon the stars. And yet, in its silence, it had changed everything. No matter what choice they made next, one thing was certain. The Galactic Senate would never be the same again.